Long before the rise of empires and the carving of borders, before any nation had a name, the San walked the earth. They were among the earliest known inhabitants of southern Africa, tracing their lineage back over 20,000 years, long before the pharaohs built their tombs or the Romans etched stone roads. Their feet left prints in the red sand long before written history dared to speak. And in those quiet steps began a story of survival, endurance, and spirit. The San, often called Bushmen by colonists, were not one tribe but a tapestry of small, scattered hunter-gatherer bands. They roamed the harsh terrains of the Kalahari Desert, the mountains of Namibia, Botswana, Angola, and parts of what is now South Africa. For millennia, the land did not belong to them, they belonged to the land. To outsiders, it seemed barren. But the San saw beyond the surface. In the crevices of dry stone and among thorns that slashed like blades, the San found life. Their eyes, sharpened by generations, could track a kudu's step over stone. Their ears heard the shift of insects underground. And in the silence of dusk, they listened to each other, to the fire, and to the ancestors who whispered from the glowing pit at night's heart. Each tribe was small, rarely more than 25 to 40 people. But they lived as one family. No kings, no written laws, only oral tradition, passed down in chants, dances, and stories drawn on the walls of rock shelters. They were artists, warriors, healers, and spirits of the dust. Their rock art, found deep in the caves and cliffs of southern Africa, is among the oldest in the world. Painted in ochre and ash, the images are more than drawings, they are memory. Lions hunted in pairs. Dancers leapt beneath the moon. Shamans transformed into animals. Every stroke carved a story, a history no scroll ever told. But the San were not naive children of nature. They were tactical, patient hunters, born with the desert in their bones. Their bows were short, carved from the hard sinews of camel thorn or wild olive trees. Their arrows, smeared with deadly poison from beetle larvae or plant sap, could kill a large antelope within hours. The San did not chase, they stalked. They followed the injured animal for miles, reading footprints like open books. A bent grass stem, a disturbed pebble, a single drop of darkened blood. These were signs, and the San read them fluently. But their true strength lay not just in their weapons. It lay in their unity. Hunting was not a solitary act. When a San man tracked an eland, he was supported by others, some to flank, some to draw distractions, and some to prepare the fire that would later welcome the kill. Women, too, were warriors in spirit. Their hands knew which root to dig, which herb to grind, and which bark to chew when fever gripped the tribe. They moved lightly, carried little, and sang to the stars. Their music was not for joy alone, it was medicine. In the trance dance, women clapped rhythmically while men circled the fire, moving faster, chanting deeper, until the boundary between flesh and spirit dissolved. Shamans fell into altered states, claiming to travel to the world of ancestors, to pull illness from bodies, and to call rain from the sky. But the San were not untouched by darkness. As cattle herders and Bantu-speaking tribes began to expand southward, pressure mounted. Their waterholes were taken. Their hunting grounds diminished. Encounters turned into confrontations, and confrontations into bloodshed. Yet, even as the world began to push them into corners, the San stood firm. They fought, not like kingdoms, not in open war, but with tactical ambushes, with traps, with arrows that whispered death from unseen places. They became ghosts of the plains, moving with silence, surviving with dignity. They whispered to the fire at night, telling stories not of conquest, but of endurance. And through those whispers, a legacy was born, one that still burns in the embers of their old fire pits. They did not build empires. They carved no monuments in stone. And yet, the San people spoke with a language older than the pyramids, older than Rome, older than all the kings of men. Their voices danced with the wind, sharp clicks, soft hisses, guttural tones echoing through the canyons and plains. It was a language of the earth, molded by the rhythm of fire and footsteps. Among them was an elder named Gao, keeper of stories and dreams. His beard was white like ash, and his eyes shimmered like dying embers, always watching. Each night, the children gathered around him near the fire pit, not to be entertained, but to remember. "Long ago," he said, tapping his stick on the dust, "we walked with the animals, not behind them. The land danced for us. The lion bowed his head when we passed. We were not kings, but the earth knew our names." The children listened in silence, their faces painted in red ochre and ash. This was not a myth. This was a memory. The San lived scattered in bands, not tribes in the traditional sense, but bloodlines connected by song and land. They followed the seasons, understanding the migrations of animals and the whispers of trees. A dry riverbed was not empty to them. It was a map, a memory trail of hoof prints, cracked stones, and faint scents carried by the breeze. Women were gatherers and knowledge bearers. They knew where the water roots slept, where the bitter melons hid, and how to grind the seeds that cured snakebite. Men were hunters, but not for glory, for balance. The hunt was sacred. They used poisoned arrows, tipped with the sap of the chrysumlid beetle. They would track a wounded kudu for 2 days, never rushing, never wasting breath. A kill was not triumph, it was a prayer fulfilled. At night, they danced the trance dance, a ritual to heal the sick, speak to ancestors, and restore harmony. The dancers stomped and sang, circling the fire until their minds slipped into the spirit world. There, they saw visions of lions turning into men, of rivers flowing upward, of fire inside the sky. This wasn't magic. It was the ancient human pulse, unbroken. But the world was shifting. Unknown shapes had begun to appear beyond the ridgelines. Horses, boots, guns, foreign tongues with sharp commands. They came not as animals, not as spirits, but as men with greed in their hearts and maps in their hands. The fire pit still burned each night, but the echoes were changing. The land had begun to tremble, and the San, the people of First Light, would soon find themselves standing at the edge of a storm. The year was not counted in numbers, the San counted time in rains and bones. But in the season when the winds grew hot and the jackals howled early, the first blood was spilled not by lion or spear, but by iron. It began near the Gariep River, where the San bands had followed the migration of Springbok. A group of San hunters had found fresh tracks, moving silently across the stone ridges, barefoot and cloaked in dry grass. Among them was young is not equal to Nisa, swift-footed, sharp-eyed, son of the elder is not equal to Gao. He was the first to see the men. Tall figures on horseback, dressed in long coats and brimmed hats, carrying tubes that screamed like thunder. These were Boer commandos, Dutch Afrikaner settlers expanding inland, laying claim to waterholes and grazing land. To the San, they were ghosts wrapped in leather. The Boers believed the San to be little more than wild thieves, raiders of livestock and game. But the truth was, the San hunted because their land was being stripped, their water stolen, their sacred hunting trails blocked by fences and wagons. One morning, a young Boer's sheep vanished from a camp near the foothills. No proof, no witness, only hoofprints in the sand. But it was enough. A commando group rode out at dawn. 20 men, muskets, whips, bloodhounds. They found the San band in a rocky gorge, not raiding, but boiling roots in a clay pot. No time to flee, no time to hide. The first shot struck a woman as she reached for her child. Chaos erupted. Smoke, screams. The air smelled of salt and gunpowder. Is not equal to Nisa ran, his legs cutting through thornbush and ash. Behind him, his uncle dropped a red hole where his back once was. The sound of drums pounded in his ears, but there were no drums. Only his heartbeat and the fading cries of his people. By midday, the gorge was silent. 17 San lay still, 3 girls were taken, tied behind horses like spoils. The boars called it punishment. But for the San it was a prophecy. The old spirits had warned them that the land would be eaten by iron and fire. That night, Nisa knelt by the fire pit, now a shallow pile of ash. The wind carried the scent of smoke and sorrow. Elder is not equal to Gao arrived, his legs trembling, his eyes hollow. He placed a hand on Nisa's shoulder. "We were not made to fight wars," he whispered. "But when the fire is stolen, even the smallest flame must burn." The next day, the survivors packed nothing but their memory sticks, bows, and silence. They vanished into the salt flats, deeper into the desert, where horses could not follow and maps turned to lies. But something had changed. For the first time in countless generations, the San would learn the meaning of vengeance. The desert had always been their shield. In the Kalahari's scorching days and bone-freezing nights, the San knew every whisper of the wind, every crack in the earth. They became ghosts, vanishing into thorn thickets, sleeping in shallow caves, drinking dew off stone leaves. But now they were more than hunters. They were watching, waiting. Elder is not equal to Gao, once a quiet man who painted stories with ochre and ash, began to speak in riddles of war. Not of conquest, the San had no kings, no empires, but of warning. He said the spirits of the first fire had awakened, that every drop of San blood spilled unjustly must be returned, not in rage, but in balance. The scattered bands, once peaceful and distant cousins, began gathering near a cluster of red sand hills called Hanu's Teeth, sacred grounds untouched by wagon wheels or settler boots. Smoke signals rose again at night. Drums beat softly, hidden beneath the rustle of wind. And in the caves, the hunters began to shape new tools, not just for food, but for survival. They dipped their arrows in beetle poison. They crafted bone traps for horses. They mapped the boar routes in the dirt with ant trails and bird calls. Even the women joined, not to fight, but to listen, memorize, and pass word from camp to camp without being seen. Is not equal to Nisa became one of the swiftest sand runners, messengers who crossed entire days of desert barefoot. He could move like a shadow, even with the sun above him. One night, he found himself face to face with a boar wagon train camped near a dried riverbed. He didn't attack. He counted heads. He studied the dogs. He vanished. 3 days later, near the same spot, one of the wagons never made it back. Horses screamed. Men found prints in a perfect circle. The next dawn, 2 boars were found, stripped of rifles, tied to trees, their boots missing, but not harmed. It wasn't murder. It was a message. The settlers grew afraid. They believed they were cursed, that the San had summoned something old, something from the earth. Fires burned lower. Guns were clutched tighter. But the San had summoned no spirits, only their memory. For hundreds of years, they had been painted as simple, peaceful foragers. But now the stories were changing. Elders told of old warrior ancestors who once hunted lions with spears and outsmarted the great elephant chiefs of the north. Elder is not equal to Gao whispered one night. If they forget we are men, then we must remind them with silence and arrows in the dark. The San were not trying to win a war. They were trying to survive it. The Kalahari would become their fortress, and the wind their ally. Night fell like a shroud across the Kalahari, and the stars stitched ancient maps above the San camps. Beneath those constellations, the San elders prepared a gathering unlike any in recent memory. A fire circle. It was not for song or celebration. It was for a decision. Around the fire sat the old, the scarred, and the silent. Hunters with jagged spears, mothers with infants wrapped in skins, and runners whose legs still carried the dust of 10 deserts. Elder is not equal to Gao placed a glowing coal on a flat stone and whispered to it as if it were alive. The wind tells us stories, he said. But tonight we speak back. The fire circle was sacred. No name was spoken without meaning. No word wasted. Only truths passed down in rhythm, slow and precise, like footsteps across hot sand. One by one, scouts shared what they'd seen. Boer wagons moving closer, watering holes seized, a new camp of armed riders building fences around Zoma, a sacred hunting ground. A hush followed. Then came Is Not Equal to Nisa. The young runner knelt by the fire and laid down something heavy. A broken rifle stock, cracked clean through. I found this where the spring used to be, he said. They poisoned the water. Even the jackals won't drink. Anger didn't erupt. It simmered. The sand didn't believe in revenge for pride. But they did believe in harmony. And when that balance was broken, nature itself demanded action. A plan formed, not of open battle, but of disruption. Sabotage. Smoke without fire. Arrows that sang from the dark and vanished. They would become shadows. Within days, young San men and women split across the desert in teams of 2. They struck silently. Salt bags on Boer carts are replaced with sand. Horse reins sliced in the night. Traps laid with such precision even dogs missed them. And always, always the arrowheads tipped in beetle venom. The settlers began to hear stories. Of eyes watching from trees. Of songs in languages no one understood. Of footprints appearing overnight in perfect circles. One night, a Boer outpost at the edge of Hanu's teeth caught fire. Not a blaze but a circle, precise, controlled, burning around the camp like a warning halo. Inside it, untouched, a sand carving, left in the sand. A human figure holding a broken gun, head bowed to the earth. It was not a threat. It was a demand. Leave. The Boers didn't listen, but they feared, and fear made them clumsy. The balance had shifted. The Kalahari was no longer theirs to tame. It was awake, and the sand was its voice. The tension that once simmered in whispers now cracked through the air like summer lightning. The settlers were done fearing shadows. Now they brought torches. One cold morning, just as the mist lifted off the thorn trees, a column of Boer horsemen stormed through the valley of Kari Dunes, where children had played and herders gathered roots. The San, caught off guard, scattered into the scrublands. They set fire to the sleeping nests. Tents made of kudu hide and woven grass curled into black ash. A grandmother who couldn't run fast enough was struck with a rifle butt. Her blood painted the roots of a baobab tree. That tree would later be known as Nabes Stone, the place where a line had been crossed. From the cliffs above, young Is Not Equal to Nisa watched. His jaw clenched, fingers twitching near the shaft of his bow. He had been trained to avoid open conflict. To hide, to outsmart. But now the pain ran too deep. Back at the new camp by the river bend, the fire circle burned low. The elders debated. Some argued that vengeance would only bring more death. Others said the spirits of the fallen demanded blood. It was Is Not Equal to Gao who stood, eyes glistening with firelight. When you strike the roots of the giraffe, he said, do not expect the acacia to survive. It was decided. They would fight, not just with arrows or traps, but with unity. Tribes from the far edge of the desert were summoned. Drums echoed from caves. Dust messengers ran for days to gather neighboring San clans. Those who had once scattered like seeds in drought. Now they returned like rain. They gathered not in thousands, the San had never been many, but with purpose. Hunters, foragers, trackers, even the reclusive Kamani, who had not spoken to outsiders in a generation, arrived in silence. Each warrior wore ochre on their cheeks. Each arrow carried the venom of the chrysumlid beetle, enough to stop a lion mid-charge. They carved war symbols into the rocks, not as a call for conquest, but as a final song to the land. If they were to fall, the earth would remember. Then they moved. Under moonlight, San fighters crept through the camped settlers like fog. They cut water skins, set oxen free, stole gunpowder bags and replaced them with sand. They weren't attacking for glory, they were dismantling the tools of conquest. But war is never clean. At Neri Gorge, a group of San were ambushed. 20 rifles opened fire. 6 died instantly. Among them, Young is not equal to Goma, who had never killed a single man. Her body was found with an herb pouch still clutched in her hand. She'd been a healer. This was the turning point. The San would now strike with the rage of drought. They painted their bodies not in ochre, but in ashes of their burned homes. They sang no songs. They moved like ghosts. And on the walls of Blood Ridge, just outside the settler encampment, they left a message scratched in ochre and coal. "We are the first fire. You cannot bury what was never dead." The settlers had rifles, wagons, and cattle that trampled the brush. The San had bone-tipped spears, poison arrows, and the land itself. It became a war of silence. Not of open fields or clashing armies, but of whispers and wind. The San moved through rock crevices, beneath dry riverbeds, behind termite mounds, places no maps dared mark. Their eyes saw paths where others saw dust. Their ears caught the flutter of vultures from miles away. The Dutch and Boer militias, frustrated by phantom attacks and disappearing trails, began retaliating in desperation. They burned entire groves, poisoned water holes, left baits soaked in strychnine to kill both human and animal. But the San endured, and they evolved. One of the most feared groups to emerge during this time was a clan known as Nora's Claw. Led by a woman named Hunu, her face marked with 3 deep scars across the brow, they became legends among both tribes and invaders. Hunu had once been a tracker for the settlers, taken as a child. But she escaped, returned to her people, and turned every learned skill against the enemy. She trained young San fighters to read boot prints, mimic settler whistles, and sow confusion in the bush. In one daring raid, her group entered a guarded settler fort pretending to be beggars. At night, they slit open the food stores, mixing powdered roots that caused days of delirium. When the settlers awoke, their wagons were gone, their oxen freed, and the fort walls marked with a single glyph, a circle split by a claw. But not all San agreed with the rising tide of violence. At Gui Caves, an elder named Is not equal to Burrow gathered families who refused to fight. They wanted peace. They believed the ancestors would protect them, that submission might preserve survival. The settlers, however, made no such distinction. Is not equal to Burrow's cave was found. A settler patrol entered during night prayers. The next morning, vultures circled over the gorge. Only one child survived, Zany, a mute boy who would later become the keeper of the San's final oral songs. The war dragged on. It wasn't like other wars, no declarations, no formal treaties. Just endless death scattered like bones under the desert sun. Still, every blow hardened the San. They began inscribing warnings in their art. Hunters drawn with bleeding eyes. Wagons tipped on their side. Fire eating the horizon. In every image, a single symbol remained. A handprint, pressed with red ochre, fingers outstretched. A mark of resistance. And now the settlers were beginning to fear them. They whispered of the bush ghosts, invisible killers who moved without sound, who spoke to snakes and vanished into thorn trees. Superstition grew. Some patrols refused to enter certain valleys. One settler journal from 1768 reads, "The Hottentot devils cursed our powder. Our men walked with fear. Even our oxen smell them in the wind. They are not men. They are something older." The San had become a myth. But behind that myth, their bones still broke, their children still starved, and their lands still burned. The world called it resistance. For the San, it was survival. By the early 1800s, the San resistance had fractured. Between hunger, disease, settler raids, and internal disagreements, many clans had vanished entirely. Grass grew over forgotten campsites. Wind erased their tracks. Only the fire-marked rocks and cracked antelope skulls whispered that someone had once stood there, proud and unbroken. But in the high ridges of what the settlers called the Moonstone Hills, the last stronghold of United San fighters remained. Led by the old but cunning warrior Hama, known as the Last Smoke Walker. They lived among narrow canyons and thorn-crushed passes, places where even settler horses refused to step. Hama had one goal left: make the land itself reject the invaders. With the help of surviving rain shamans and poison makers, they began crafting traps so cunning and cruel that even hardened militia feared pursuit. Spears carved from giraffe bone hidden beneath sand pits, bait animals with poisoned hides, hornet nests tied with sinew to snap open as riders passed. In one haunting instance, a militia patrol entered the hills to hunt a supposed rebel group. Only one man returned. He spoke of rocks moving in the night and arrows that sang before striking. When asked to lead another group back, he spat and walked into the desert, never seen again. Desperation pushed settlers to extremes. They began offering gold and cattle for captured San, dead or alive. Whole bounty caravans roamed the deserts with dogs trained to sniff San musk. Skulls of hunted San were displayed at frontier posts like trophies. Their stories called it clearing the land. But the soil remembered, and the Moonstone Hills bled. One rainy night in 1812, a combined force of Dutch, Boer, and local hired trackers, over 60 armed men, ascended the ridges to end the San resistance once and for all. Hama knew they were coming. He didn't gather his people to fight. Instead, he led them to a secret crevice known only through generations of oral passing, a place called Gorakai, the throat of the mountain. There, the final clan vanished into the stone. When the soldiers reached the summit, they found nothing. No fires, no bones, no footprints, just a single ochre handprint on the cliff, and below it, painted in white ash, a line of 7 dots circling a sun. It was a farewell, and a warning. The settlers claimed victory. They wrote in their ledgers that the Bushman menace had been extinguished, that the land was now pure. But for years afterward, travelers reported strange encounters in the hills. Footsteps with no source, faint whistling in dead silence, oxen panicking at invisible movement, and near the rocks, new red handprints appearing after each storm. Even today, San descendants believe that Hama and the last clan became part of the hills, spirits walking the wind, guarding what little remains. Their names may never appear in written scrolls or golden records, but the desert remembers, and the fire of the San still flickers, not in war, but in survival. As the smoke of war faded from the ridges and valleys, something else quietly endured. Not the spears, not the arrows, but the songs. San oral traditions were never written in ink. Their stories were carved in memory, passed from grandmother to child, from elder to hunter. Even as their lands were stolen and their people slaughtered, the ancient storytelling ceremonies, survived in whispers. They sang of rain animals that danced in the clouds, of trickster gods like Kagan, the mantis who created the moon, of great hunts where eland spirits guided the arrows, of nights when the stars wept for fallen warriors. These weren't just myths. They were maps, survival codes, ethics, and identity all folded into rhythm. And while many San were scattered, forced to become herders, laborers, or hidden outcasts on settler farms, the songs kept traveling, disguised in lullabies, woven into work chants, buried in the hum of wind through grass. In the 19th century, as colonial administrators declared the San people extinct or absorbed, a few missionaries and linguists began noticing something odd. In isolated corners of the Kalahari and Karoo, they heard children humming tunes that didn't match the local Bantu rhythms. They witnessed elders clicking in patterns unknown to them. They saw women using fire dance rituals to heal fevers, just like the ghost tribes once did. The San weren't gone. They had survived not in armies, but in ancestry and breath. In 1874, a German ethnographer named Wilhelm Bleek, along with his sister-in-law Lucy Lloyd, began documenting the language and stories of San prisoners and servants in Cape Town. What they uncovered changed the world's understanding. Hundreds of tales were transcribed in delicate notebooks about rain spirits hiding in baobab trees, about gods with crocodile teeth, about sacred stones that sang when touched. And with every word, the myth of San extinction cracked. One informant named Zamka Ke, a former prisoner, told them, "We are like the wind now. You cannot hold us, but we are there." These stories revealed more than folklore. They unveiled a memory of resistance, of identity not crushed by muskets, but remade in silence. Meanwhile, in the veldt and desert, some San groups still wandered thin, sunburnt, wary of all outsiders, yet proud in their silence. They moved with the moon. They drank from hidden springs. They still hunted springbok and porcupine with poison reeds. Their footprints were light, but their presence undeniable. Today, anthropologists now believe the San may be the oldest continuous culture on Earth, with roots stretching back more than 20,000 years. They were here long before the empires, before the maps, before the names. And though they no longer raise armies, their most powerful weapon remains: memory. The songs still live, in children tapping rhythms on stones, in elders tracing hunting paths in the dust, and in fireside tales of spirits that walk the stars. Because no bullet can kill a story well told. By the early 20th century, the San people had become ghosts in their own land. Governments drew borders over their hunting routes. Colonial railways tore through ancient watering holes. Fences went up. Cattle replaced land. And the rifle replaced the bow. But in the remote corners of Namibia, Botswana, and Angola, in the burning Kalahari sands and among thorny acacia thickets, a few San groups still resisted. Not with rage, but with silence. Not with cities, but with the earth. Among them were the Juhoansi, once called the real people by neighboring tribes. They still spoke in ancient cliques and moved with the rhythms of the moon. They still remembered the giraffe dance, the rain animal, and the burning feet of the hunter spirit. In the 1950s, a San tracker named /UI led a government expedition through the Kalahari for weeks, navigating by nothing but the stars and termite mounds. Scientists were stunned. He didn't need maps. He carried them in his head. But the world was changing. Military regimes took over. Diamond mines spread across sacred hunting grounds. The Bushmen were labeled unproductive, primitive, and backward. San children were sent to boarding schools. Bows were banned. Languages suppressed. Ceremonies outlawed. And yet they endured. In 1961, a small San group known as the Kung were filmed by American anthropologists during a trance dance in the Kalahari. The footage showed women clapping in circles, men stamping their feet until they collapsed into shaking visions. They claimed to pull sickness from the bodies of children using only fire and rhythm. The world called it mysticism. They called it healing. In the 1980s, during South Africa's apartheid war in Namibia and Angola, some San were recruited as trackers by the military, ironically used by the very state that once hunted them. These men could detect faint boot prints in dry grass, identify rebels by the bend of broken twigs. They were ghosts turned soldiers. But the cost was high. Many of these San were later abandoned when the war ended, left in refugee camps, broken between two worlds, no longer welcomed by traditional clans or the governments they served. Still, in the ashes, some sparks remained. Elders began teaching children again, drawing eland in the dust, showing them how to shape arrows with bone tips. Language revival projects began. Museums in Botswana and Namibia started honoring San rock art. San leaders stood before the UN, demanding land rights and cultural protection. One leader, Roy Sisana, said, "We do not want cities. We do not want money. We want the land, the stories, and the silence." In 2006, the San people of Botswana won a landmark legal case to return to their ancestral land in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, a land they had been forcibly evicted from. It wasn't just a legal victory. It was a whisper turned into a roar. The last arrow wasn't dipped in poison. It was dipped in memory. Because while empires rise and fall, While names change and flags fade, the earth remembers its first children. And in the silence of the sand still walks, barefoot, invisible, unbroken. In the lonely valleys of southern Africa, where rock towers cast shadows over salt flats, ancient echoes still linger. These lands, scarred by time, blessed by starlight, hold stories deeper than bone. Among these tales is the story of Gaona, a San warrior whose name meant, "He who moves with dust." He lived sometime in the early 1800s in what is now Namibia. But to San, it wasn't a country. It was the great place, stretching from fire to fire, from Kudu Trail to Lion Cave. Gaona was no chief, no king. He was a hunter, tall, lean, eyes like quiet lightning. He could run a full day with no water, track a jackal over sun-cracked stone, and sleep beside scorpions without flinching. But the land had begun to change. Settlers were coming. Trekboers with ox wagons, guns, and laws carved from distant cities. They brought fences, horses, and diseases the San had never known. They laughed at the Bushmen, calling them ghosts, thieves, or beasts. One morning, Gaona returned from a hunt to find his family gone. Burnt huts, hoofprints, rifle shells. He tracked the raiders for 6 days, across thorn felt and dry stream beds, always just a few hours behind. He followed the scent of tobacco and the red ash they left behind. On the 7th day, he found them camped under a camelthorn tree. 10 men, 2 wagons, his wife tied to a post. They were eating meat from his kill. That night, under a moonless sky, Gaona crept like wind. One by one, he lost poisoned arrows. One to the throat, one to the back, one to a snoring man who never saw morning. By dawn, the camp was silent. Only one man remained, the leader, wounded, crawling, begging. Gaona didn't speak. He placed his bow down, picked up a stone, and made sure the land remembered. This story is not found in textbooks. It's carried in whispers, shared by firelight. A tale of resistance not in armies, but in heart. San warriors didn't ride horses or wear steel. They wore dust. Their arrows weren't many, but each one was a verdict. They didn't fight for conquest. They fought for silence, for the right to hear wind through grass, to follow elephant paths, to live without chains. Centuries later, Gaona's story lives on in the /AI/AE cave, where red ochre paintings show a lone figure holding a bow, standing over lions, surrounded by stars. They say if you sleep there during the dry months, you'll hear footsteps in the dark. Not angry, not loud, just present. And maybe that's the truth of the San. They don't rage. They endure. In the parched belly of the Kalahari, where rain is not a promise but a miracle, the San did not beg the skies, they called them. The shamans of the San were not priests of power. They were dreamers of bone and breath, walking the line between spirit and dust. They wore no robes, no jewels, just painted faces, leather cords, and fire in their eyes. Their most sacred ritual was the trance dance, a spiritual journey that was more than ceremony. It was war, healing, memory, and rain. As night fell, the tribe circled the fire. Women clapped rhythmically. Men began to dance, stomping, swaying, chanting in clicks and hums. The beat rose like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The shamans would enter a deep trance, fueled by breath, song, and centuries of memory. They believed the number, a spiritual energy, rose in the belly and climbed up the spine during the dance. When it reached the head, the trance opened like a doorway. The shaman would fall, twitching, eyes rolled back. He would rise again, transformed, not quite in this world anymore. In the trance, he claimed to see the spirit world. A vast, glowing plain filled with ancestors, animal gods, and water spirits. There, he fought off sickness, pulled out invisible arrows from the sick, and pleaded with rain animals to bless the land. The rain animal, they said, was not a god. It was a great, shimmering beast, sometimes a serpent, sometimes a giraffe with scales, sometimes just mist with horns. It lived in a cave at the edge of the world. If pleased, it would gallop through the sky, its hooves breaking clouds into rain. Not everyone returned from the trance. Some shamans never woke up. Others went mad, their minds burned by visions too large for words. But those who survived were respected beyond all, not feared, but held close, like fire in the cold. The power of the trance was real. Modern researchers, including the famous anthropologist Lawrence van der Post and later David Lewis Williams, studied the sand dances and found the physiological signs of trance, hallucinations, and altered states to match their stories perfectly. Sand rock art across Botswana, South Africa, and Namibia shows figures with bent backs, bleeding noses, and arms raised, just like in the trance. This wasn't mythology. It was an experience. Lived, felt, danced. And in a land where crops failed and rivers vanished, belief wasn't luxury. It was survival. The sand didn't wait for help. They danced it down from the stars. Among the sand, childhood was not a waiting room for adulthood, it was training. And the threshold to manhood wasn't crossed by age. It was crossed in blood, breath, and courage. Boys of the sand were taught from the age of 6 how to track footprints, not just to see where an animal walked, but why. Was it limping? Was it frightening? Was it pregnant? The sand told stories, and they learned to read it like scripture. But when a boy reached around 15, the elders watched him. Not his strength, his stillness. Not his voice, his listening. The boy who walked beside the wind and did not speak louder than a whisper of leaves. He was ready. Then came the rite of first blood. No horns, no feasts, just silence and a lion. The sand did not kill lions for pride. But in rare moments, when one grew old, sick, or aggressive, threatening the herds, the elders selected a group of initiates. They would not use spears. They would not ambush. They would track. For days, sometimes weeks, the young men followed the lion's path, sleeping little, eating less, learning its patterns, feeling its rhythm. Then, when the moment came, they cornered it. Not to attack immediately, but to stare it down. To meet death not with arrogance, but with clarity. One of them, the chosen one, would step forward, heart pounding louder than drums. With a small poisoned arrow, just one, he would kneel, aim, and fire. The poison was not immediate, could take hours. So they followed the lion, silently as it grew weaker, until finally it lay down in exhaustion. They approached it not with cheers, but with deep breaths and murmured songs, asking its spirit to forgive them. They painted their faces with its blood. They whispered their names into its ear. And then they carried the lion's skin back, not as a trophy, but as a symbol. The boy had died on that journey. The man had returned. But not all survived. Some were wounded. Some disappeared, taken by the desert or the lion or their own fear. The sand did not mourn them while weeping. They lit a fire, sang to the stars, and etched a single animal on a nearby rock wall. That way the boy was not gone. He had become part of the land. And for those who returned, they were never the same. Their eyes held a quiet depth, like they had seen the other side of the sun and came back only because they chose to. That was manhood in the old San way. Not strength, stillness. As the San warriors readied themselves for the final confrontation with the encroaching Boer raiders, the desert wind carried strange whispers, voices of ancestors, some said. The elders, cloaked in ochre and ash, circled the sacred fire, painting bones with symbols that told stories of past battles and glories, of defeats and sacred pacts made under blood-red moons. It was not just war. It was remembrance, prophecy, and duty. Women and children were moved deep into the salt caves, guided by hunters who knew every crack and breath of the land. Spears were blessed with the blood of kudu, and war chants echoed across the dried riverbeds. The San believed that by invoking the spirits of the land and sky, the battle would not only be physical, it would be spiritual. As dawn approached, A low thrum vibrated the ground. Not drums, there were none, but feet, hundreds of them, stomping in rhythm, mimicking the heartbeat of the desert. The sand warriors advanced with painted faces and silence, their bows drawn, eyes narrowed. The raiders, arrogant in their modern rifles, were unprepared for the ghost-like precision of these desert shadows. Arrows found gaps in armor, in joints and throats. Spears sliced through confusion, and smoke bombs made from dried roots blinded the invaders. But the battle was not without cost. The San were outnumbered, and for every raider that fell, a San soul bled into the sand. By twilight, the land was littered with both enemy and kin. The San, victorious but broken, carried their dead wrapped in hides, chanting the songs of farewell. The desert winds howled louder that night, as if mourning and applauding at once. In the weeks following the battle, the San did not celebrate. They mourned in silence, honoring their fallen by walking barefoot across the sacred ridges of the great Kalahari. Each step was a prayer, each breath vow to never forget. The elders proclaimed it a time of stillness, a time to listen to the earth. At night, under a looming blood moon, the remaining warriors gathered at the ancient fire pit of Tama, the place of origin in their oral history. Here, generations of San had returned to speak to their ancestors. Now, the survivors kneeled in a circle, placing the weapons of their fallen in the center. One by one, they told the names of those lost, their deeds, their spirits now part of the wind and flame. Elder Koho, the tribe's oldest living memory keeper, stood up slowly. His voice, like cracking bark, recited the words only spoken during great sorrow. We are the breath of the first fire. We do not vanish. We become echo. The ceremony was the beginning of withdrawal. The San knew they could not remain in that blood-soaked land. Too many had seen their sacred places desecrated. Too many wounds ran deeper than the body. And so, the decision was made not of surrender but of survival. They would return to the hidden places of the Kalahari, to the caves that had sheltered their ancestors, where maps were carved into stone walls and stories whispered through dripstone chambers. They would hide not in fear but in wisdom, and in the silence they would wait, for time, for remembrance, for the world to hear them again. Their footprints began to vanish behind them, covered by the desert wind. But the San walked on, vanishing into myth, leaving behind painted rocks, ancient songs, and the story of a people who never stopped listening to the land. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The San seemed to disappear from the world's surface. Colonial maps erased them. History books ignored them. But in the wind that danced across the dunes, in the deep hum of the Kalahari night, something endured, an echo, a rhythm, a whisper of those who came before. Some said the San had all perished. Others believed they had turned to spirits, guiding lost travelers through the desert. But hidden deep within the folds of Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, small communities of San descendants quietly lived on. They no longer carried poisoned arrows or danced in war paint under starlit skies, but their souls remembered. Anthropologists in the 20th century would stumble upon their caves, filled with ochre rock art, giraffes mid-stride, elephant herds roaring silently from stone, hunters locked in ancient chase. These were not decorations. They were memories, carved in defiance of oblivion. Their language, filled with melodic clicks and tones, became one of the oldest surviving tongues on Earth. Their knowledge of plants, weather, animal migration, and stars proved more sophisticated than most scientists could comprehend. Yet, even then, the world still called them primitive. But the San never needed the world's approval. Their greatest strength had never been conquest, it was endurance. Their songs were now sung in quiet corners of remote villages. Children still danced the trance dance under firelight. Old women still whispered to the wind before planting roots. And when the rains came, soft and rare, The San would lift their faces skyward and know they had never vanished, only stepped back into the earth from which they were born. And in the heart of every storm, behind the rustle of dry grass, and within the silence after sunset, one could still hear it, echoes from the fire pit. The lost souls of the San warriors, still watching, still walking,